I came here to talk about Trump pulling out of the Paris Accords.
Yes.
And what that actually means and how much we should actually care. Because this seems to be one of those scenarios where either you think it's the end of the world or you think it was entirely useless. And I don't think that either of those interpretations are incredibly accurate or as accurate or nuanced as they need to be. So, to frame this conversation, maybe to tilt my hand a little bit, I'll ask you all a question. And then we'll go, we will go into the meat of this. On a scale of 1 to 10, how useful do you think the Paris Accords were? Don't answer that question yet. 1 being completely useless, 10 being incredibly useful, and you can useful legally, useful pragmatically, useful symbolically. Go ahead, John. First, go ahead.
I think it was probably about a 3 or a 4. It's useful symbolically only. It doesn't put any ramifications in place for anyone who does not meet the accords. It doesn't do nearly enough in terms of what we have to do to combat climate change. So really, all it is it's making it a nice little piece of paper for everyone to sign and say, hey, we're doing this. And in that way, almost it makes it counterproductive to what we need, which is actual damn reform.
Okay, Rich. Scale 1 to 10. How useful Paris Accords? Go.
Essentially, building off of John's point, although I put it somewhere closer to a -3 to 4, maybe even -5, because of the point that you made at the closing of that, which was how its symbolic nature basically gives us the feeling like we're doing something when we're actually just, not changing nearly enough to change the path that we're on. That's going to be devastating to the communities that are going to be impacted by the climate change overall, with coastal communities and especially island nations and particularly the developing nations as well. But so I mean, I think, and I think Brandon's going to touch on this point later about Nicaragua and why they weren't signed on and how they got lumped in it. So I won't step on that too much.
No, but, we're going to get into nuance of it. I just want to get to all you guys' initial thoughts. So Adair, scale of 1 to
is Adair back because he joined us?
Yeah, Adair, scale of 1 to 10. How useful were the Paris Accords?
I'm going to go with Rich. I'm going to say I'd honestly put them in the negatives. Okay, there it goes. It came back. I put them in the negatives just because the simple fact of the matter is they didn't do enough. And the fact of the matter is nothing is enough unless it calls for an immediate and total shutdown of all fossil fuel production, all fossil fuel use the world over. Because the only way we're going to actually combat climate change in any real meaning, in any real effect right now, is to completely stop using fossil fuels and start working on nothing but renewables. That's the only way that we can get back to a semblance of what our climate was before we decided to go and mess everything up. And this is not just me being some kind of radical, but this is backed by actual data. This is something that a lot of climate scientists have said for years. Only way, and because I say this because we're beyond the point where we could go back to where we were before pre-industrial revolution levels. We can no longer get back to that, but we can do something close. And the only way we can do that is if we immediately, right now, stop using all fossil fuels and go strictly to renewables. So
essentially, if we treat it like the emergency that it is.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'm going to push back a little bit on that because I see it as, I'll downgrade it to a 2, because at least you had a national platform where people are agreeing that it was true. And so I just see that being beneficial. Now, do the steps that they said to take in the accord, do they matter? No, it's bullshit. But at least you had everyone saying, look, this is true. Climate change is a disaster.
I don't give a damn if you think it's true or not. Like, you believing it, climate change doesn't care if you believe if it's real or not.
Oh, I understand that.
Climate change don't give a damn.
Well, I'm gonna answer the question now. I'm with John. I think it's about a 3-ish in terms of how useful it is, and I think at least how useful it is in actually actively fighting climate change. And I think its use is entirely symbolic, right? And but I also agree with that symbolism being a double-edged sword, and this is why I'm more sympathetic to the idea that it's useless or counterproductive than I am to the idea that it is the end of the world entirely if it's not there. But I don't want to fall into the same trap that has occurred, previously amongst people discussing the Paris agreements and not actually talk about what's in them, or rather what it prescribes. Because we see a lot of people talking about, this is the end of the world. How could Trump do this? Or, it's not that big of a deal. But they seem to not be engaging with the actual 16 pages that exist as they exist. And I'm not going to read all 16 pages to you because that would be ridiculous and not particularly helpful. But I will explain, basically what's in them, right? So what it does is all signatories commit to about a soft target of 2 degree of keeping the increase in temperature, global temperature, lower than 2 degrees, right? As opposed to the better target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. It allows individual nations to decide how much exactly they're willing to do to actually meet that goal. They can decide whether or not that's a reasonable goal. They can decide whether or not they are going to commit resources, establish laws, et cetera, to meet that goal. And furthermore, it doesn't allow poor countries, specifically in the global south, to seek damages from more developed nations for climate disasters that affect them, in order to rebuild or repair. And essentially, it's an accord. It's non-binding. It's completely voluntary. There is no sort of legal ramifications if you violate it. That's why it's not a treaty. No, it's not a treaty. It's an accord. Go ahead.
And the reason why was that was lobbied by America. The U.S. government lobbied, or the Obama administration lobbied to make it that way because they knew they could never get it past the Senate for ratification if it was a treaty.
Oh yeah, obviously. I mean, that was one of the justifications, that if they did not weaken it to the point of it being almost incredible, not only is the goal not sufficient, that 2 degree, keeping carbon emissions to a point where they only increase global temperatures by 2 degrees Celsius is not enough, obviously, and it doesn't even establish a binding path to that goal. And that was again lobbied by 2009 Obama administration in pursuit of pleasing U.S. corporations and allied oil states, right? Mm-hmm. There's a good piece about this in ironically or coincidentally, The Intercept by Naomi Klein. She talks about exactly this, that the Obama administration lobbied to keep this agreement non-binding, which is not surprising because the U.S. sabotaged Copenhagen and sabotaged Kyoto.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a long history of this sort of thing happening. And so me and you, John, are like on one side of this. We think that it actually had some use, right? So describe to me what you think its use was. You said symbolic. I think it's symbolic too.
Because at least you can hold up and say, look, we all agree that this is a problem. And right now we've got half of our goddamn country is saying this is not a problem. It's made up and it's non-believing. And in that way, also, it's a double-edged sword, though, because half the country still thinks Obama was Muslim. And so you've got the same people on the same side of the goddamn issue. And so I honestly think, though, that at least admitting there is a problem is the first step, and that's what this does. Whereas Kyoto and the rest of Copenhagen, which we sabotage, kind of make it seem like everybody in the United States feels this is not a problem at all.
How about you, Adair? You said it's useless.
I did say it's useless, and here's the reason why. And I'm going to kind of push back against what you had to say, John. It's nothing against you. It's simply this. I don't give a shit what half of the people think. I don't care. I don't care if half of the people in this country think the sky is purple. I don't care. Reality doesn't care. Therefore, elected officials should not care. The people in charge, the only thing you should care about is the scientists who have gathered and interpreted the data and told you this is a thing that needs to be done. And the fact of the matter is, a symbolic win is not good enough. It's just not. The fact of the matter is symbolic wins are not going to help us reverse the trend of the climate change that we're facing right now. Symbolic wins are not going to stop the ocean from rising 3 to 4 feet. Symbolic wins are not going to stop islands in the South Pacific, specifically ones around Australia or wherever, getting mined out for as much of the fertilizer compounds as they can, and then sinking into the ocean. A symbolic win is not going to bring back the Great Barrier Reef.
Yeah,
I don't give a shit about symbolic wins. What I care about is what's happening in real life right now. And to that extent, the Paris Accords really don't mean anything. They really don't. And the fact that they're just in accords is part of why they don't mean anything. The fact that Trump could just pull out of them is a part of the reason why it doesn't mean anything. And when he said, I was elected to represent Pittsburgh, not Paris, Pittsburgh wants them, bruh. So if you're elected to represent Pittsburgh,
Pittsburgh didn't vote.
Pittsburgh did vote. Pittsburgh is a fan of the Paris Climate Accords. So if you're there to represent the bird, do the right thing.
Also makes you wonder, like, does he actually know what the Paris Accords are, right? Like,
Not
because
a chance in hell.
No. There's no way he knows.
they don't really have a lot to do with Paris, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, they do, but then they don't really have a lot to do with Paris. Like, similarly, they don't impose anything. And so, like, this idea of, well, I'm here to represent Pittsburgh, not Paris, like, oh, that's very cute and alliterative, and we know how much I love alliteration, but that has nothing to do with the actual, meat of the Accords. Like, it's not about Paris or pleasing people in Paris. That's just where, they treated Versailles. It's like, it's not really about Versailles. It's no, regardless.
If you talk
Don't forget,
Versailles,
there was a push for
people won't know
Patriot
that.
fries at one point in this country. Like, don't
Oh my
underestimate
God,
the pettiness of our vindictiveness towards France, particularly among that political segment. A couple things I just wanted to add real quick was that we got to be careful when we say half the country, because usually we're talking about Republicans, and usually we're talking about voting Republicans, which is about 25% of the country, give or take. Half the country has realized that this political process has nothing to do with them other than punishing them for existing within it, and so they've more than less checked out, and so their opinions, I think, they tend to be more, I think, on the liberal side, but feel that, or to the left, but feel that there's nobody representing them. But I just wanted to touch on those quickly. Go ahead.
Well, I was saying half the country in specific references to polls that say that half the country. So that's not a matter. It doesn't filter down to Republicans or anything else. I'm talking about literal polls. Like, 70% of the country believes in angels. Like that. That's that's.
That's true. I think when you get to adults, I think climate change and understanding climate change is more. I think it's more widely accepted. I think when you limit it to registered voters or
a Gallup poll has 47% of the country viewing climate change as a actual extreme problem. Like that's the Gallup poll right there.
Right.
Okay.
Gallup says that 47% of Americans view climate change as a pressing issue. When you look at other polls and look at the biggest issues they necessarily vote on, climate change doesn't really rank as high. But when asked specifically about climate change, they view it as the rightfully so, as an existential crisis. And so again, I flip back and forth between both John and not all three of you, right? John and then Richard and Darren on the other side. But I think there is, Naomi Klein puts this in her article, the theoretical power present within the Paris Accords to, for moral and popular pressure, right? For people to name and shame countries who are not doing their part, for the populace of certain countries to, cite the Paris agreements and cite the fact that individual statesmen are not living up to the spirit of them, quote unquote, specifically Justin Trudeau.
Yep.
Yeah. And it has a decent-ish benchmark, right? 2 degrees Celsius is not where it needs to be. That's 1.5 degrees at least. But 2 degrees is better than 3 or 4 if it was actually met. But where it falls apart is the fact that there is no enforcement mechanism, which again was something that we lobbied for. We lobbied for there to be no enforcement mechanism within the bill.
Which is important in the context of the impacts of the U.S. drawing out or pulling out of it in general that are being painted.
Yeah, I mean, the reason we can draw out of it is because it's not a treaty. Right. And so there might not be any actual consequences. We've seen people are talking about actually putting consequences in place. But if we're going to talk about the symbolism of it, as it pertains to fighting climate change, then we have to talk about the fact that it does provide this cloak to continue to pollute, but to still, pretend as though you are fighting climate change. Just pretend as though you are actually, in good faith, performing up to the expectations of the agreement.
Right.
I mean,
that was the whole thing.
As John, as John said, it's important for countries to acknowledge that climate change is man-made, but
I don't think it was. I don't think the rest of the world was as behind us as the Republicans, or as behind on that as the Republicans are in our country.
Yeah.
Literally, no one else in the world is as behind on climate change as we are.
Yep.
Go ahead, John.
No, that's it. I mean, everybody, including Russia, is further ahead on acceptance of climate change as a reality than we are. And, the Obama administration soft-footed this issue because they knew they were going to face political difficulty at home. And so that was, like I said, they themselves, the Obama administration, lobbied to make sure that this wasn't a treaty that would have to be ratified. They made sure that this wasn't something that would have any stick to it. Just like, I mean, if you remember, part of the reason why the TTIP fell apart was because the Obama administration was lobbying to lessen the environmental regulations that the EU was imposing. So, that is just the history of that administration. We're going to say we're going to do something, and then hey, turns around, it's not as good as we're saying it is.
Yeah, and
Well, I
so
mean, I think in
so
some
quickly,
cases,
just
nothing.
to the idea that then when the U.S. is pulling out, that weakens the idea that that this is going to be enforceable or that this agreement has more teeth. It's actually kind of to the opposite, in that the U.S. pulling out of the agreement gives the remaining people the opportunity to try and create an enforcement mechanism without the United States opposing it.
Yeah.
But even if they did that, here's the issue. Even if they did that, the fact
it's
of the
not
matter
gonna
is
be
the
enough.
United States, it won't change anything. We're going to outproduce everybody with as much carbon as we can. I mean, you've got a fad with Republicans in their big, ridiculous, unnecessary trucks called coal rolling, where they literally install smokestacks and then modify their truck to burn copious amounts of coal, not even get anywhere near a decent rate of combustion, just so they can have thick, tarry smoke come out because let's show those social justice warriors with my big, compensation machine. Like it doesn't matter. We have to actively change, and we have to outlaw carbon. We have to outlaw natural gas. We have to move to strictly renewables. Otherwise, we're not doing good enough. Period.
I agree 100%. I agree. Well, let me finish this. I agree 100%. My entire job for the past 14 years was essentially battling climate change for on the water. I mean, that's what I did. When I wasn't deepening a harbor, that was what I did. And so, like, to watch it happen and to see some of the plans that are actually currently being worked on by the Army Corps of Engineers to combat climate change in New York City, in Boston, in Florida, in all those places, to see what they're trying to do, like the amount of money that we're going to sink into the fact of into protecting areas of this country because we're denying that we have a problem is fucking staggering.
Yeah, the preparations they're making aren't to actually prevent climate change; it's to prevent the impacts of climate change, raising tides and impacting larger water bodies.
Exactly.
And it's fucking staggering. Trillions and trillions of dollars.
And
so,
I think that
honestly,
this Paris Accord allows the whole entire world to kind of get on that footing, and this is going to be an acceptable level of climate change. This is going to be an acceptable level of environmental impact, and we're going to make sure that there's going to be businesses that benefit from all of this, and this is going to be a global accord in managing that. That's what I see when I look at it, and that's why I view it as negatively.
Well, I mean, so here's the thing, right? So there is definitely that empty performative gesture that tricks people into thinking that climate change is actually being fought, right? Because we know that Exxon, a month after this came out, a month after this accord was signed, Exxon released a statement that was released a report rather, that assured that fossil fuels would still be meeting 80% of global demand up until 2040, right? So that's actually impossible by the mandate of the accords. Like, for the accords to be met, we would have to be actually, waning off of fossil fuels by the mid-century. We'd have to be way more than 80% on renewables by 2050. So that's just not, that was the amount of contempt that Exxon and other oil companies had for the Paris Accords. And, that leads us into whether or not Trump knew what he was doing, right, when it came to doing this. Because it was never an option.
Who's the Secretary of State?
And also whether or not the reaction has been even mildly appropriate, because let's be honest, there was never a chance that Trump was going to actually participate in the Paris Accords in good faith, right? Like that just wasn't an option. We know that in his first week, he signed executive orders on Keystone. He signed executive orders on the Dakota Access Pipeline. He appointed Rex Tillerson to head Secretary of State and Pruitt to head Secretary of EPA. He was already rolling back the clean power plan that was signed under Obama. And so really what it reveals that there were only really two options under the Trump administration. There was stay in, but don't actually participate in reducing carbon emissions, or there was just tear it up, right? You just tear it up. And so the real difference here becomes an optical difference, and thus political fallout, as opposed to any actual difference in carbon emissions, or rather measurable one. But correct me if I'm wrong.
I mean, it's like you said, it's optics. Like you said, I mean, he appointed Rex Tillerson as his Secretary of State.
Yeah.
He appointed the CEO of he was the CEO of ExxonMobil or something like that, one of the big oil companies. You can't appoint an oil company exec and then say, hey, guess what? I'm going to do so great with climate change, we're going to make the best climate ever. I mean, it's just garbage.
Not only that, but Exxon's being sued. Exxon's being sued because in the 1970s they discovered climate change and then lied about it for fucking 40 years.
I mean, it's just performative theater. It is literally nothing more than performative theater. It's been nothing more than performative theater. That's all the Paris Accords have been. And I'm just kind of tired. I'm over symbolic victories. Unless we actually start doing something and actually start affecting change, then it doesn't actually matter. And I don't give a shit if the entire world is against, if the entire world's population hates you for it, you still need to do it. Because the fact of the matter is, if we don't start doing it, a whole lot of people are going to start dying, and then so will the planet. That's it. Like, that's the fact of the matter.
Well, I'm more sensitive to symbolic victories if it's within the realm of something that is not existential, right? Like a symbolic victory in climate change is not really enough. Acknowledgement without change in this particular field is not enough to warrant excitement over this thing. And I think some people are treating it as though it was actually a mandate to get us down to below 2%. 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, but it wasn't that. It was basically an acknowledgement that climate change was man-made and that we could do something to fight about it, and a pledge to perhaps, it was an abstinence pledge in terms of actual efficacy. Yeah. It was essentially, I said on Twitter, the Paris Accords is an abstinence pledge. It makes people feel good. These people care, but in the end, you're probably still fucked. And I mean, in Trump's rationale for pulling out, again, the responsibility of Pittsburgh, not Paris, as though this is going to create meaningful jobs, or rather that the Paris Agreement was actually preventing meaningful jobs from being created when it didn't impose anything. No, like it simply didn't. That's why Tillerson wanted to stay in. Tillerson was one of the people who wanted to stay in because as a member of Exxon, a high level official in Exxon, he knew just how weak it was. And he was like, okay, if we stay in, we can keep rolling back the clean power plan, we can keep polluting, but at least we don't have to deal with the political fallout of not being in this accord. But we know that the renewable job sector has more jobs than coal and oil, and more potential for job growth.
Well, yes. And I think that's part of what I see in the Paris Accord as well, is that and to Adair's point about how it's not enough, and that these things are going to happen inevitably anyway, I think a lot of the members of the accord recognize that there's some inevitable climate and global and environmental impacts that are going to happen, and see an opportunity to both shift the energy sector power hegemony across the world, and also to profit off of things like that John was describing with the Corps of Engineers looking at ways to shore up shoreline cities and things like that. There's going to be a lot of private contractor money in developing those kinds of things, and globally, and so having some sort of organized group that orchestrated that means that you can do a lot of things, and U.S. pulling out of that has impacts there as well. And so I think that there's an aspect to that. I can't go into more detail. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I didn't want to talk about the, in terms of the repercussions of pulling out of the Paris Agreement. I didn't want to reduce it down. I wanted to focus in the beginning, at least, on the actual effect on climate change. What it's supposed to find, not the effect on trade, because there does appear to be some. You can look at the Paris Agreement as though it's a trade deal, that it agrees to trade in stuff like, solar panels, natural gas. Although natural gas is so bad for the environment, like. Fracking is so bad for the environment.
Yeah.
There's another aspect that I think we should touch on, but continue.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that the whole Paris Accord and all the talk about the green energy movement, just because we've been fighting, particularly in this country, against Republicans who refuse to even see the realities of climate change, we don't really get into the way that the raw materials for green energies are harvested from developing nations. We don't get into the environmental impacts of the waste products or the waste results of the development of these things. So in some cases, particularly in the early stages, especially solar, more so than wind, did cause more environmental damage in the development stage than its coal or carbon alternative. And so moving forward, while we may be creating less of a carbon footprint, we have to look at the toxic chemicals that are produced as a result of green energy as well, I think.
That's not as true as it used to be.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
it's been changing.
That's fair.
But it's also the harvesting of the raw materials, I think, that it's most relevant to.
You don't need as much of that.
No. I mean, even tidal energy, you could switch to tidal energy and you'll have a less of a problem with the harvesting aspect of it. I mean,
there's something like there's something like 400 times the amount of energy required for the United States in offshore wind, and building offshore platforms aren't that difficult.
No, that's not
No,
true.
I think you guys bring up an excellent. I think
No,
you guys bring up.
this is according to my professor who has her PhD in mechanical engineering, and particularly in wind energy. Like, this was something we talked about. Like, this is doable. Wind energy is doable. Wind energy is actually a lot cheaper. It's not as difficult to make offshore platforms.
It's definitely doable.
Quickly, this is exactly what I'm talking about. It's important to talk about the negative externalities of green energy so that we pursue the right path rather than just whichever one feels the best or looks the best. But continue the argument. I'm glad that's fair.
Well, I'm just saying, as someone who works in the industry offshore, like it is difficult to build them. It's not as difficult as the people are making it out to be. It's still like a difficult undertaking. I mean, it's massive construction.
It's never gonna be easy, but it's not. In reality, like, realistically speaking, it's not that hard. Like, we've moved to a point where it's not this insurmountable task.
Yes,
I know, because my project, like my project was researching offshore wind energy and offshore wind energy platforms. I even did the calculus for a lot of it. Like, it's not as difficult to do.
It should be easier than drilling. It should be easier than drilling 1,000 or like mile down into the earth
thing,
and so on and so forth.
Here's actually the thing, though. Like, that's not the argument for why people aren't doing it, right? The idea, like, the arguments for why people don't want to pursue wind and sun energy are usually stupid, right? They're like, well, what happens on days there's no wind? What happens if it's cloudy outside? So you guys want to get into a nuanced conversation about like how difficult on a scale of 1 to 10 is it to build, offshore wind turbines. That's a great conversation, but that's not the conversation anyone else is having. It's not most people. I mean, most people. I mean, like, actual Republican elected officials are having. It's like, well, the sun goes down at night. What if you need to use your TV? It's like that's the level of the discourse everyone else is at. And I think that the negative externalities of producing solar panels, great conversation, not nearly as bad as the negative the downstream externalities of fracking, of burning coal, of any of those other things, right? And so, and speaking of job growth, like, renewable energy is, if the Democrats gave a shit about climate change, renewable energy is actually a great, rather, job growth in the renewable energy sector is a great thing to run on, because you can reap, you win the Sun Belt, right? You win the Sun, instead of focusing on the Rust Belt, focus on the Sun Belt, focus on these places where renewable energy has a real chance of being a job creating machine, right? And for lack of a better term, and stop trying to like focus on manufacturing jobs and actually work on a sector that has the ability to grow. And again, it's one of the fastest growing sectors in the world.